On a scorching morning in September 1942, somewhere in the Egyptian desert behind General Montgomery's lines, Commander Richard Daniel crouched beside a fuel supply depot and watched American gasoline drain into the sand. The temperature had already climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat waves shimmered off the rocky ground. The air smelled of petroleum and hot metal. Daniel was a quality control officer for the United States Navy, a chemical engineer by training posted to American refineries in the Middle East. His job was to ensure that fuel shipped from America actually reached the combat vehicles that needed it. But that morning, Daniel witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of the war. Stacked before him were hundreds of American fuel cans, 5-gallon containers manufactured in the United States, shipped across the Atlantic through submarine-infested waters, unloaded at Egyptian ports, transported by rail to this depot. They were supposed to feed Montgomery's tanks for the coming offensive against Rommel. Instead, they were bleeding gasoline through split seams and corroded joints. The desert sun had turned each can into a swelling, leaking disaster. The thin metal expanded in the heat. Seams that had been tight in a Pennsylvania factory were now separating under the relentless Egyptian sun. Dark stains spread beneath the stacked containers. The smell of evaporating fuel hung in the air like an accusation. Daniel picked one up. The rolled seams along the bottom had already started to separate. Fuel dribbled down his hand, staining his uniform sleeve. The screw cap was corroded, the threads stripped from rough handling during transport. He needed a wrench just to open it. He threw it back onto the pile in disgust. 40%. That was his estimate after 3 days of inspection, a figure he later admitted was deliberately inflated to provoke alarm in Washington. But even if the true losses were somewhat lower, the scale of waste was staggering. Fuel shipped from America to Egypt was being lost to evaporation, spillage, and container failure before it ever reached a combat vehicle. American workers produced it. American sailors transported it through submarine-infested waters. American taxpayers funded it, and it was soaking into desert sand. But here was the thing that made Daniel's stomach turn. Sitting 20 feet away, neatly stacked in perfect condition, were captured German fuel cans. The enemy's containers. Not a single leak. Not a single swollen side. Not a single corroded cap. American and British soldiers fought over them like treasure, hoarding them, trading cigarettes for them, refusing to let them out of their sight. Daniel walked over and picked up one of the German cans. It was heavier, more solid. He flipped a lever on top and the spout opened instantly. No wrench required. He tilted the can and fuel poured out in a smooth, fast stream without splashing or gurgling. He flipped the lever back and it sealed tight. The whole operation took 3 seconds. Daniel held the German can in one hand and an American can in the other. One worked perfectly. One was a disaster. And the Americans had been using the disaster for nearly 3 years of war. Daniel set down the cans and stood in the Egyptian sun, trying to understand how this had happened. How had America, the most industrially advanced nation on Earth, failed to produce a simple fuel container that worked? He didn't know it yet, but he had stumbled onto one of the greatest unforced errors of the Second World War, and he was about to discover that America had already seen the solution, studied it in detail, and deliberately thrown it away. The German fuel can that would change history was born between 1935 and 1937, developed through a systematic military procurement process in the industrial town of Schwelm, Germany, nestled in the hills of North Rhine-Westphalia. Adolf Hitler understood something that most military planners overlooked. The weakest link in his plans for lightning warfare wasn't tanks or aircraft or trained soldiers. It was fuel supply. His panzer divisions could only move as fast as their gasoline could follow. Every armored thrust depended on a chain of supply stretching back to refineries and depots. If that chain broke, if fuel containers failed in the field, the entire blitzkrieg strategy would collapse. Hitler had studied the First World War. He knew that the great offensives had stalled not just from enemy resistance, but from logistical exhaustion. Armies outran their supplies. Fuel ran short. Momentum died. He was determined that German mechanized forces would never face that problem. In late 1935, the German army issued an invitation to tender for a new fuel container. The specifications were demanding: The container had to hold 20 liters, approximately 5 gallons. It had to be strong enough to survive rough handling, drops from trucks, stacking in depots, transport across terrible roads. It had to work in extreme temperatures, from the scorching North African desert to the frozen Russian steppes. It had to be easy to carry, quick to open, fast to pour. It had to be manufacturable in massive quantities using existing German industrial capacity. The assignment landed at the Schwelmer Eisenwerk Müller and Company in Schwelm, where chief engineer Vinzenz Grunvogel took on the challenge. Grunvogel was a meticulous engineer with a gift for understanding how objects would be used in the real world. He didn't design at a desk. He talked to soldiers, watched them handle equipment, studied the conditions they faced. Grunvogel quickly realized he was not designing a can. He was designing a weapon. Every feature had to serve the demands of mechanized warfare. Soldiers needed to carry fuel across rough terrain, pour it quickly under fire, and store it without losing a single drop. The container had to survive being dropped from moving trucks, baked in 100-degree heat, frozen solid in Russian winters and stacked by the thousands in supply depots. It had to work when soldiers were exhausted, frightened, under enemy fire, working in darkness. The existing designs were hopeless. German industry, like industry everywhere, used simple rectangular cans with screw caps. They leaked. They required tools. They were slow to fill and slow to empty. They couldn't survive the punishment of military use. Grunvogel started from scratch. He began with the most basic questions. How heavy could the filled can be for a soldier to carry? How would soldiers grip it? How would they stack thousands of them? How would they open it quickly in combat? How would the metal behave in extreme temperatures? He prototyped and tested, refined and tested again. By 1936, 5,000 prototype cans were produced for troop trials. German soldiers used them in exercises in real field conditions and reported what worked and what didn't. Grunvogel listened. He made refinements based on their feedback. The handle design was adjusted. The closure mechanism was improved. The indentation pattern was optimized. After refinements based on field testing, the final design was officially adopted by the Wehrmacht on July 8, 1937, designated in General Army Bulletin No. 324, the Wehrmacht Einheitskanister, the Armed Forces Standard Canister. It would become known to the Allies simply as the Jerry Can, and it would prove to be one of the most important pieces of military equipment in the entire war. The German can held 20 liters, roughly 5 gallons. It was rectangular, stackable, and built from 2 halves of pressed steel welded together at a recessed seam around the middle. That recessed weld was the first genius detail. By placing the seam in a protected channel, Grunvogel ensured that impacts and rough handling wouldn't damage the joint that held the can together. When a can was dropped or struck, the impact hit the flat sides, not the vulnerable seam. It was a small thing. It made all the difference. The sides featured distinctive cross-shaped indentations. These weren't decorative. They strengthened the can's structure, while allowing the metal to flex when fuel expanded or contracted with temperature changes. In the scorching North African desert or the frozen Russian steppes, the German can wouldn't burst at the seams. The indentations absorbed the stress. 3 handles ran across the top of the can. This design solved multiple problems at once. A single soldier could carry 1 full can using the center handle, or 2 empty cans by gripping the outer handles of 2 adjacent cans with 1 hand. In a bucket brigade formation, soldiers could pass cans rapidly down a line, each man grabbing a free handle before passing it along. But the true brilliance lay in the opening mechanism. Instead of a screw cap that required a wrench and inevitably leaked, Grunvogel designed a cam lever closure. A simple flip of the lever opened the spout instantly. Another flip sealed it tight with a rubber gasket. No tools required, no fumbling in combat. No stripped threads or lost caps. Inside the spout, Grunvogel added a small breather tube that connected to an air pocket beneath the handles. When fuel poured out, air flowed in through this tube, creating a smooth, fast stream without the gurgling and splashing that wasted fuel and time. A soldier could empty a full can in seconds. That same air pocket served another purpose. If a full can was dropped into water during an amphibious landing or a river crossing, it would float. The trapped air kept the 45-pound container bobbing on the surface. Finally, the interior was lined with a synthetic resin coating, similar to technology originally developed for steel beer barrels. This lining meant the same can could carry gasoline, diesel, or drinking water without. Contamination. 8 genius details. 8 solutions to problems that would cripple Allied logistics for years. By 1939, the German military had stockpiled thousands of these cans ready for war. The Allies had nothing like it. In the summer of 1939, with war clouds gathering over Europe, an American engineer named Paul Pleiss was working in Berlin. He was a senior executive at Ambi Budd Presswerk, a German subsidiary of the Philadelphia-based Budd Company. The firm specialized in pressed steel technologies, producing car bodies for BMW and Ford at a factory that had once belonged to the aviation pioneer Edmund Rumpler. Crucially, Ambi Budd was one of the manufacturers producing jerry cans for the Wehrmacht. Pleiss had watched Germany transform over the years he'd worked there. The Nazi regime was openly preparing for war. Military contracts had replaced civilian production. The factory that once made automobile bodies was now building military vehicles. At some point before the outbreak of war, Pleiss acquired detailed knowledge of the jerry can design. As a senior executive at one of the manufacturers, he had direct access to specifications and manufacturing processes. According to widely circulated accounts, he obtained physical samples and complete technical specifications, though the exact circumstances remain unclear from surviving records. What is documented is that Pleiss departed Europe on the SS Washington, leaving Le Havre on September 11, 1939, just days after Germany invaded Poland. He arrived in New York on September 18th, carrying knowledge that could have transformed Allied logistics, if anyone had been willing to listen. Back in America, Pleiss told military officials about the German container. He explained its features, its superiority, its potential to transform fuel logistics. The War Department listened politely and showed little urgency. By the summer of 1940, Pleiss had arranged for a complete jerry can to reach American officials. He sent one to Washington. The War Department examined it, acknowledged its clever design, and made a decision that would cost thousands of lives. They decided their existing containers were good enough. The American military was still using a cylindrical 10-gallon can with 2 screw closures, a design from the First World War. It required a wrench to open and a funnel to pour. It was heavy, awkward, and prone to leaking, but it was familiar, and the tooling already existed. The lone German jerry can was sent to Camp Holabird in Maryland, home of the Army's Vehicle Research and Development Center. There, American engineers were tasked with creating an American version. What happened next was a case study in missing the point entirely, a masterclass in how to take a perfect design and make it worthless. The engineers at Camp Holabird looked at the German can and saw a shape. They copied the rectangular form, the 3 handles, the 20-liter capacity. But they didn't understand why the German design worked. They saw features without grasping function. They saw a container without seeing the system of interlocking solutions that made it effective. In a report dated September 18, 1940, delivered to the Armored Force Board and titled Advantages of the German Can, the Camp Holabird team had documented exactly why the German design was superior. The German can would stack without shifting or rolling. It was light enough to carry yet strong enough for field use. A full can would float. The handles were ideal for bucket brigade operations. The closure required no tools for opening and no accessories for operation. It would not open without intent and would stay open while pouring. A vent pipe enabled smooth fuel flow. Dirt, sand, and water would not collect around the opening. They understood everything that made the German can brilliant, and then they ignored it all. The American redesign eliminated the cam lever closure. Instead, they installed a screw cap, the same type that had caused problems for decades. The official reason was economy. The Army had stockpiles of screw fittings left over from previous contracts. Using them would save money. The unofficial reason was institutional inertia. American industry knew how to make screw caps. The tooling existed. Changing to cam levers would require new equipment, new training, new suppliers. It was easier to use what they had. The result was that every American soldier would now need a wrench to open his fuel can. In the chaos of combat, wrenches got lost. They fell into mud. They disappeared into supply dumps. Soldiers without wrenches couldn't refuel their vehicles. Soldiers with wrenches fumbled in darkness, under fire, with cold hands, trying to turn threads that corroded and stripped after a few uses. The German soldiers flipped a lever in 3 seconds. American soldiers needed a tool and 30 seconds of fumbling. The redesign also eliminated the spout design that allowed easy pouring. A funnel was now required to transfer fuel without spilling. Another tool to carry, to lose, to fumble with. German soldiers tilted and poured. American soldiers hunted for funnels while gasoline splashed on their boots. The recessed welded seam was replaced with rolled seams around the bottom and one side. Rolled seams were cheaper and faster to produce. They required less skilled labor and simpler equipment. In a factory, rolled seams made perfect sense. In a war zone, they were a disaster. Rolled seams failed when cans were dropped. They split when cans expanded in heat. They leaked when cans were stacked, and the weight compressed the bottom layers. Any petroleum engineer could have explained that storing gasoline in a container with rolled seams was inherently unsafe. The Germans had known this. That was why Grunvogel used a single welded seam placed in a protected recess. The engineers at Camp Holabird either didn't ask the right questions or didn't listen to the answers. The interior synthetic resin lining was eliminated entirely. The official reasoning was that the lining added cost and manufacturing complexity. What the accountants didn't understand was that the lining served multiple purposes. It protected the metal from corrosion, which extended the can's service life. It prevented fuel from picking up metallic taste, which could indicate contamination. Most importantly, it meant the same can could carry gasoline, diesel, or drinking water without cross-contamination. Without the lining, American cans couldn't safely be used for water. Soldiers in desert environments, where water was as critical as fuel, couldn't use their fuel cans to carry water when needed. They needed separate containers, separate logistics, separate problems. The air pocket and breather tube disappeared from the American design. These features had enabled German cans to pour quickly and smoothly, to float when dropped in water, and to accommodate temperature expansion without bursting. Without them, American cans poured slowly and splashed fuel everywhere. They sank when dropped during amphibious operations. They burst at the seams when the desert sun heated their contents. The cross-shaped indentations that strengthened German cans, while allowing flex, were replaced with a simplified X pattern that provided less structural flexibility. The American cans would be more likely to burst in extreme temperatures, less able to survive impacts, weaker overall. 8 genius details. The Americans missed every single one. They kept the shape and threw away the function. The redesigned American jerry can entered production. First contracts were let in September 1940, and the first American-made jerry cans were delivered in March 1941. The cans were lighter than the German original, 10 pounds versus 11.5 pounds empty. That was the only improvement. In every other way, it was a step backward, a monument to the arrogance that assumed American engineers could improve on a design they didn't understand. Meanwhile, crates of obsolete screw-cap fittings sat in army warehouses, finally finding a use. The money saved on those fittings would be repaid many times over in fuel lost to leaking containers, vehicles stranded without fuel, and soldiers who died because their tanks ran dry at the wrong moment. The British took a different approach. When British forces first encountered German jerry cans during the invasion of Norway in 1940, they immediately recognized the superior design. These were the Jerry's cans, they said, using slang for Germans. The name stuck. Later that year, Pleiss was in London. British officers asked him about the can's design and manufacture. Pleiss provided technical knowledge from his experience at Amby Budd. The British examined the design carefully, documented every feature, and made a decision that would help win the war. They copied it exactly. British companies, including Briggs Motor Bodies, Vauxhall Motors, and the Pressed Steel Company, began manufacturing faithful reproductions of the German design. Same cam lever closure, same recessed weld, same breather tube, same synthetic resin lining. The British understood that the German engineers had already solved every problem. There was nothing to improve. By early 1943, 2 million British-made jerry cans had been shipped to North Africa. But America remained oblivious. For 2 more years, American soldiers would suffer with inferior containers while their allies used captured German cans and British copies. The cost of America's mistake became horrifyingly clear in the North African desert. But before we return to that desert, we need to understand what the Allies were fighting with before the jerry can arrived. At the start of the Second World War, the British Army relied on a container officially known as the petrol, oil and water can. Soldiers called them flimsies. The name was bitterly accurate. These 4-gallon cans were made from thin tin plate, typically manufactured where labor was cheap. 5 pieces of flat metal were welded together with crimped or soldered seams. The can had a single handle on top, a bent piece of metal that cut into hands and made carrying awkward. It required a wrench to remove the screw cap and a funnel to pour without spillage. The flimsy had been designed for peacetime transport of lamp kerosene along paved European roads. It was adequate for that purpose. It was utterly inadequate for mechanized warfare in harsh conditions. But when war came, the British Army had nothing else. Millions of flimsies were in inventory. Changing designs would take time. Time was something the British didn't have. In the North African campaign, flimsies proved catastrophic. The consequences would shape the entire war in that theatre. The desert was unforgiving to poorly designed equipment. Temperatures soared past 120 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. Sand worked its way into every seam and joint. The terrain was rock-strewn and brutal, shaking vehicles and cargo until weaker components failed. The flimsies were never designed for this. They had been made for gentle transport along European roads, not the punishment of mechanized desert warfare. The crimped seams split during transport over rough terrain. Every journey across the rock-strewn desert was a gauntlet that the flimsy containers rarely survived intact. Trucks bounced over wadis and through shell craters. Cans slammed against each other, against the truck bed, against anything hard. Each impact stressed the seams. Each stress brought them closer to failure. A single journey across the desert could transform a shipment of sealed cans into a pile of leaking wrecks. Some flimsies lost 20% of their contents before reaching their destination. Others lost 50% or more. The loss rate depended on distance, terrain, temperature, and luck. None of these factors were controllable. One quartermaster reported that his 70,000 gallons of fuel had been reduced to just 30,000 gallons during transport. When he complained, he was told that even this was considered a good effort. 30,000 gallons out of 70,000. A loss rate of 57%. More than half the fuel gone before it reached any vehicle. When flimsies were stacked for shipping, the upper layers crushed those below. The thin metal couldn't support the weight. Seams popped, fuel leaked. In the holds of cargo ships, this meant gasoline accumulating in the bilges. The vapors built up. Sailors worked in an atmosphere that could explode at any spark. At least one ship was lost when the accumulated fuel ignited. The crew never had a chance. In the hot desert sun, the problems multiplied. The thin metal expanded faster than the seams could accommodate. Cans swelled grotesquely, seams burst, fuel sprayed across supply dumps. The smell of evaporating gasoline became the signature scent of Allied logistics in North Africa. Every transfer from one container to another required a funnel, and funnels meant spillage. Soldiers watched precious fuel splash on the ground, on their uniforms, on vehicles that were waiting to be refueled. Each drop lost was a drop that wouldn't power a tank or an aircraft. Each drop lost was a German advantage. British historian Desmond Young, who served in North Africa and later wrote a biography of Field Marshal Rommel, captured the frustration perfectly. No one who did not serve in the desert, he wrote, could realize to what extent the difference between complete and partial success rested on the simplest item of equipment. And the worst. Whoever sent our troops into desert warfare with the petrol tin has much to answer for. General Claude Auchinleck, who commanded British forces in North Africa, estimated that the flimsy containers led to the loss of 30% of all fuel sent to the theatre, 30% as a baseline, higher under adverse conditions, an appalling tax paid to bad engineering. Because of this, General Archibald Wavell's defeat of the Italians in 1940 came to nothing. His planes sat on desert airfields, grounded for lack of fuel. His tanks halted in the sand, empty. His trucks couldn't deliver supplies because they had no fuel to make the trips. The Italians should have been finished. Instead, they held on because the British couldn't maintain the pressure. By the time fuel supplies were restored, the moment had passed. General Auchinleck's victory over Rommel in 1941 withered away for the same reason. The Desert Fox was in retreat, the British had him on the ropes, but tanks need fuel to pursue a beaten enemy, and the fuel was bleeding away through split seams and burst cans. Rommel escaped. He would return stronger than ever. In 1942, General Bernard Montgomery approached El Alamein differently. He refused to attack until he had accumulated overwhelming supplies. Among those supplies were thousands of captured German jerrycans and newly manufactured British copies. For the first time, British fuel would arrive at the front intact. Montgomery won at El Alamein for many reasons, but reliable fuel containers were one of them. The only good thing British soldiers found to do with empty flimsies was convert them into cooking stoves. They called these improvised devices Benghazi burners or Benghazi boilers. Cut a flimsy in half. Fill the bottom with sand, pour in some gasoline, light it. You had a silent, fast, smokeless cooking fire that could heat water for tea or cook rations without revealing your position to enemy aircraft. It was a fitting end for containers that couldn't serve their intended purpose. At least as stoves, they finally did something useful. The British Army cooked its food with the same cans that lost its fuel. Meanwhile, German jerry cans captured in battle became the most prized items in the desert. British soldiers hoarded them, traded for them, and refused to let them out of their sight. The enemy's fuel containers were literally keeping the British Army mobile. After the second capture of Benghazi at the end of 1941, large numbers of German jerry cans fell into Allied hands. Elite units like the Long-Range Desert Group were finally equipped with containers that actually worked. These were the men who could now range deep into enemy territory, confident their fuel would arrive intact. By 1942, General Montgomery understood the equation. He made sure he had enough supplies, including jerrycans, to defeat Rommel, despite the waste caused by inferior containers. His victory at El Alamein owed something to the captured German cans that kept his tanks moving. And where was America in all this? Still using the flawed Camp Holabird design, still losing fuel to leaking seams and cracked welds, still requiring wrenches and funnels while British soldiers flipped cam levers and poured fuel in seconds, still clinging to a design that traded battlefield effectiveness for warehouse economics. That was the situation Commander Richard Daniel walked into in September 1942. Daniel and his colleague were quality control officers posted to American refineries in the Middle East. Their job was to ensure fuel reached combat units in usable condition. What they found was appalling. Fuel arrived by rail from the sea in 55-gallon steel drums with rolled seams and friction-sealed caps. Local laborers handled the drums roughly. Many leaked before they reached the transfer point. From there, fuel went into the infamous 5-gallon petrol tins. These were the same square cans of tin plate that had been used for decades to supply lamp kerosene. They were hardly suitable for gasoline. In the hot desert sun, they swelled, burst at the seams, and leaked. Every transfer required a funnel, which meant spillage. Every trip across rough terrain meant more containers failing. Daniel estimated that a massive percentage of gasoline shipped from America to Egypt was lost before reaching combat vehicles. Fuel that American refinery workers produced, that American sailors risked their lives to transport across submarine-infested waters, that American taxpayers paid for, was soaking into desert sand because nobody in Washington had listened to Paul Pleiss. But Daniel also saw the solution sitting right in front of him. Allied soldiers in Africa knew that the only gasoline container worth having was German. They fought to capture enemy jerrycans. They treasured British copies. They refused to use American containers if any alternative existed. Daniel examined the German cans. He noted the cam lever closure, the recessed weld, the breather tube, the synthetic resin lining. He compared them to the American version and understood immediately why one worked and the other didn't. He sent an urgent report back to Washington. The Army's 5-gallon container was a disaster. The improved jerry can under consideration was little better. The Germans and British had already solved this problem. America needed to copy their solution exactly. Daniel's report landed on desks in Washington and created immediate alarm. Officials requested confirmation. Daniel provided it, with detailed documentation of losses and comparative analysis of container designs. The result was a major policy shift. Production of the Camp Holabird design was scaled back. An agreement was reached that British production of the original German design would be increased to supply both British and American forces for the invasion of Europe. The jerry can that the United States War Department had rejected in 1940 would finally equip American soldiers, 4 years late, manufactured by British factories based on German engineering. Millions were ready by D-Day. The jerry can that Hitler had designed to fuel his conquest of Europe would now fuel his defeat. June 6, 1944. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. 156,000 Allied troops crossed the English Channel in the pre-dawn darkness. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft. American, British, and Canadian forces stormed the beaches of Normandy under withering German fire. At Omaha Beach, American soldiers faced murderous crossfire from entrenched German positions on the bluffs above. Over 2,000 American casualties fell on that single stretch of sand. But by nightfall, the Allies had a foothold on the continent. The liberation of Europe had begun. Behind those assault troops came the logistics. Within hours of securing the beaches, supply operations began. Landing craft ferried ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fuel onto the sand. Every bullet, every bandage, every gallon of gasoline had to cross the channel and make its way inland. The invasion could only succeed if the supply chain held. For 7 weeks, Allied forces fought through the hedgerows of Normandy. The dense bocage country, with its sunken lanes and thick vegetation, favored the defenders. Every field became a fortress. Progress was measured in yards and paid for in blood. By the end of July, more than 1 million Allied soldiers were ashore in France, but they remained confined to a lodgment only 50 miles wide and 20 miles deep, roughly half the size of Long Island. The invasion seemed in danger of bogging down into the trench warfare of 1914. Then came the breakout. On July 25th, Operation Cobra punched through German lines south of St. Lo. American bombers carpeted the German positions. Infantry and armor surged through the gaps. Suddenly, Allied forces burst out of the confined Normandy hedgerows and onto the open fields of central France. General George Patton's Third Army, held in reserve, until now, was unleashed. Patton was the perfect commander for this moment. Aggressive, relentless, impatient with caution. His tanks raced eastward with a ferocity that stunned the Germans, 80 miles in a week, then 100 miles, then further still. The Wehrmacht was in retreat, their lines collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. Patton pushed his men and machines to their limits. He didn't want to give the Germans time to regroup. He knew that momentum in warfare is a weapon as powerful as any tank gun. Keep moving, keep attacking, keep the enemy off balance. His philosophy was simple. A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week. Paris fell on August 25th. French resistance fighters rose up within the city. Free French forces under General Leclerc entered the capital. The swastika came down from the Eiffel Tower. After 4 years of occupation, France was being liberated. Victory seemed within reach. Then Patton's tanks began grinding to a halt. Not from enemy action, not from battle damage, from empty fuel tanks. On an average day, Patton's Third Army and General Courtney Hodges' First Army consumed a combined 800,000 gallons of gasoline. Think about that number. 800,000 gallons. Every single day. 28 divisions were advancing across France and Belgium, each requiring 700 to 750 tons of supplies per day. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, but mostly fuel. Without fuel, tanks were just steel boxes. Without fuel, trucks couldn't deliver ammunition. Without fuel, the advance would stop, and the logistical system couldn't keep pace. The problem was geography and destruction. The railways had been bombed to pieces by the Allies themselves before D-Day, a necessary destruction that had helped isolate the Normandy battlefield, but now crippled supply lines. French railway workers had sabotaged what the bombs had missed. The elaborate rail network that had moved goods across France for decades was now a tangled wreck of twisted steel and shattered bridges. The Germans still held the major cargo ports. Le Havre wouldn't fall until September 12th. Antwerp, the great prize, wouldn't be captured until September 4th, and its approaches wouldn't be cleared of German resistance until late November. Until then, everything had to come through the congested Normandy beaches and the single artificial Mulberry Harbour that had survived the great storm of June 19th. From those beaches, supplies had to travel hundreds of miles by truck over narrow French roads to reach the front lines. Roads built for peacetime traffic were now carrying the weight of modern mechanized warfare. They crumbled under the endless convoys. Bridges groaned under loads they were never designed to bear, and every mile of distance was a mile of potential failure for the supply chain. General Omar Bradley later wrote in his autobiography that, on both fronts, an acute shortage of supplies governed all operations. That dull subject again, he called it. But there was nothing dull about tanks sitting empty while German forces regrouped. In these desperate days of late August 1944, American commanders conceived the Red Ball Express during a 36-hour brainstorming session. Named after railroad slang for express freight, it was a massive trucking operation that would become one of the greatest logistical achievements in military history. Over 6,000 trucks were organized into non-stop convoys running on dedicated one-way routes. One road northbound, one road southbound, both reserved exclusively for military traffic. French civilians were barred from using them. Signs with distinctive red balls marked the routes. The drivers ran around the clock, 20 hours a day with only brief rest stops. They covered up to 350 miles each way, from the Normandy beaches to supply dumps near Chartres and beyond. They drove at night without headlights to avoid German aircraft, navigating by the faint glow of blackout lights on the truck ahead. They pushed their vehicles until the engines gave out, then hitched rides back for replacements and started again. Roughly 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were African American soldiers. The army was segregated, and black troops were typically assigned to support rather than combat roles. These men faced the danger of enemy strafing runs, the exhaustion of endless driving, and the discrimination of a nation that refused to acknowledge their courage. They drove through villages where French civilians cheered them as liberators. They pushed through checkpoints where German aircraft strafed their convoys. They wrestled with worn-out trucks, bald tires, and engines that overheated on the endless runs. When vehicles broke down, they fixed what they could and abandoned what they couldn't. They slept in their cabs, ate cold rations on the move, and kept driving. The conditions were brutal. Summer dust coated everything. Autumn rains turned roads to mud. Drivers went days without proper rest. Accidents were common on the blackout runs, trucks colliding in the darkness or sliding off rain-slicked roads. Some drivers were killed by German aircraft, others died in crashes. Most just kept driving until the exhaustion and the stress wore them down to nothing. They kept the liberation moving anyway. Without the Red Ball Express, without those predominantly black drivers, Patton's advance would have stopped dead. The liberation of France was carried on the backs of men who weren't even allowed to eat in the same mess halls as their white counterparts. And what filled many of those trucks? Jerry cans. 5-gallon containers stacked by the hundreds, each one carrying the fuel that kept Patton's tanks advancing. When fuel tankers weren't available, petroleum moved in 55-gallon drums and 5-gallon jerry cans. An armored division needed over 73,000 gallons of fuel just to move 100 miles. A single 2.5-ton truck could carry 875 gallons in jerry cans. Do the math. It took fleets of trucks carrying thousands upon thousands of cans to keep the armor rolling. From August 25th through November 16th, 1944, the Red Ball Express operated continuously. Motor transport services hauled over 412,000 tons of supplies, including vast quantities of fuel stored in jerry cans. On its peak day, August 29th, The Red Ball Express delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies using nearly 6,000 vehicles. By Victory in Europe Day, some 21 million Allied jerry cans were scattered across the continent. 21 million. The German design that Hitler had stockpiled for Blitzkrieg was now powering the Allied advance that would destroy his Reich. The losses were staggering, a testament to the chaos of modern mechanized warfare. Soldiers were supposed to return empty cans to collection points for refilling. In theory, the same can could make dozens of trips between depot and front line. In practice, empty cans were abandoned everywhere. In the desperate race across France, soldiers had no time to organize logistics properly. Empty cans were thrown from moving trucks to save weight. They were used as stepping stones across muddy fields. They propped up tables in field headquarters. They became improvised latrines, toolboxes, cooking pots, and furniture. Some were simply left where they fell, forming metallic carpets across the French countryside. In October 1944 alone, 3.5 million jerry cans were reported lost. 3.5 million in a single month. The shortage became so severe that it threatened to slow the advance. Fuel was available in rear areas, but there weren't enough containers to carry it forward. The logistical miracle was choking on its own success. The American military offered cash rewards to French civilians for returning empty containers. The prize system spread across liberated France. French schoolchildren scoured fields, ditches, and roadsides, collecting discarded cans and hauling them to collection points. They searched hedgerows and farmyards, drainage ditches, and abandoned bivouacs. Every recovered can was another trip's worth of fuel that could reach the front. Approximately 1 million cans were recovered this way. French farmers found jerry cans useful for their own purposes and kept many that might otherwise have returned to military use. The cans made excellent containers for milk, water, fertilizer, and 100 other farm needs. To this day, World War II-era jerry cans turn up for sale at markets throughout Normandy. They surface in old barns, in estate sales, in the collections of militaria enthusiasts who recognize the distinctive German design. But even with the losses, even with the chaos, the jerry cans kept fuel flowing to combat vehicles. The system bent but didn't break. The advance continued. The Germans retreated toward their homeland. And the humble fuel container, the one piece of equipment that nobody wrote songs about, proved decisive. The scale of the operation was staggering. Thousands of trucks running day and night, millions of jerry cans cycling between rear areas and the front. A river of fuel flowing across France measured not in barrels, but in individual 5-gallon containers. Each can was filled, transported, emptied, and ideally, returned to be filled again. The entire system depended on those rectangular steel containers with their distinctive cross indentations and 3 handles. Allied commanders understood what had happened. The jerry can had enabled an advance across France that exceeded even the pace of the German Blitzkrieg of 1940. American armies had advanced faster than the German armies that invented lightning warfare. The student had surpassed the teacher, and the jerry can, a German design turned against its creators, had made that possible. The irony was perfect. Hitler had developed the jerry can to fuel his conquest of Europe. Instead, it fueled his defeat. The container that carried gasoline for German panzers rolling into Poland carried gasoline for American tanks rolling into Germany. The innovation that enabled Blitzkrieg enabled the liberation. In the official records in Washington, little is said about the jerry can's contribution. A military report notes simply that a sample of the jerry can was brought to the office of the quartermaster general in the summer of 1940. No mention of the rejection, no mention of the flawed redesign, no mention of Commander Daniel's urgent report from Egypt, no admission of error. The institutional memory prefers silence to embarrassment. The American failure wasn't corrected until Commander Daniel's report from Egypt forced Washington to confront reality. By then, the war was 3 years old. Countless tons of fuel had been lost to leaking containers. Operations had stalled for lack of gasoline. Men had died because their vehicles ran dry at critical moments. All because officials in Washington had assumed they knew better than the German engineer who had actually solved the problem. The jerry can story reveals a pattern that appears throughout military history. Innovation often comes from unexpected places. The best solutions sometimes belong to the enemy, and institutions frequently reject what they didn't invent themselves. Paul Pleiss never received official recognition for transferring jerrycan technology to the Allied cause. He served as European industry consultant to the Board of Economic Warfare during the war and achieved the rank of colonel, but died in 1947 without acknowledgement for his contribution. Commander Daniels' report saved the Allied fuel supply, but his name is largely forgotten outside specialized military history. The jerrycan itself, the humble container that helped enable the liberation of France, receives no monuments. No museum exhibits celebrate its 8 genius details. No historians write best-selling books about Vinzenz Grunvogel and his revolutionary design. Today, the jerrycan remains in service with military forces around the world. NATO countries still use containers based on the 1937 German design. Modern versions have evolved from steel to high-density polyethylene polymer, but the fundamental features remain unchanged. The cam lever closure, the recessed weld, the breather tube, the 3 handles, they all work as well today as they did nearly 90 years ago. Walk into any army surplus store and you can buy a jerrycan. Hold it in your hands, flip the lever and open the spout, feel how solidly it closes, understand that you're holding a piece of engineering perfection that helped determine the outcome of the deadliest war in human history. The lesson is clear. In war, every detail matters. The design of a fuel container seems insignificant compared to tanks and aircraft and battleships. It doesn't fire bullets, it doesn't drop bombs, it doesn't sink ships. But without fuel, tanks don't roll. Without rolling tanks, armies don't advance. Without advancing armies, wars aren't won. A German engineer named Vinzenz Grunvogel understood this in the mid-1930s. Working at Schwelmer Eisenwerk Müller and Company in Schwelm, he designed a container that solved every problem soldiers would face in mechanized warfare. He thought about how men would carry it, how they would open it under fire, how it would survive rough handling, how it would perform in extremes of temperature. He sweated every detail because he knew the details were everything. An American engineer named Paul Pleiss understood this in 1939 and 1940 as a senior executive at Amby Budd Presswork, one of the very manufacturers producing jerrycans. He recognized the design's genius and worked to transfer that knowledge to America. He tried to give his country an advantage that could save thousands of lives. A naval commander named Richard Daniel understood it in 1942. Standing in the Egyptian desert, surrounded by leaking American cans and perfect German ones, he grasped what Washington had missed. He wrote the report that finally forced the American military to confront its failure. Eventually, American military officials understood it too. They scaled back production of their flawed design. They made a deal with the British to produce jerrycans for both armies. They admitted implicitly that they had been wrong. But understanding came late. In war, late understanding is measured in lives. How many soldiers died because their vehicles ran out of fuel? How many offensives stalled because supplies couldn't keep pace? How many victories turned to stalemates because the logistics failed? The numbers are impossible to calculate, but they are not zero. The jerrycan stands as a testament to the power of good design. When something works perfectly, you don't improve it. You preserve it. The jerrycan worked perfectly from the beginning, and that's why it endures. The story of the jerrycan carries a warning for every institution that believes it has nothing to learn from outsiders. The American military of 1940 was not lacking in talent or resources. It was lacking in humility. The assumption that American methods must be superior blinded officials to evidence sitting right in front of them. Paul Pleiss didn't just bring a can to Washington. He brought a complete engineering solution, tested and refined through German military procurement, proven in the field. He explained why every feature mattered. He provided specifications detailed enough for immediate production. The response was institutional indifference, followed by a redesign that preserved nothing but the shape. This pattern repeats throughout history. Organizations reject outside innovations not because they lack the ability to understand them, but because acknowledging superiority elsewhere threatens internal hierarchies and assumptions. The cost is measured in failure, waste, and in wartime, lives. The British, fighting for survival, couldn't afford such pride. They copied the German design exactly and equipped their forces with containers that worked. America eventually followed their lead, but only after years of unnecessary losses. The jerry can sit quietly in military museums today, an unassuming artifact proudly displayed right alongside tanks and heavy artillery pieces. Visitors walk past without a second glance. It doesn't look like a weapon. It doesn't look like something that changed the course of history. Yet without it, the liberation of Europe would have ground to a halt. The tanks would have stopped, the trucks would have stalled, the advance would have died. The next time you see a jerry can at a surplus store or in someone's garage, take a moment to appreciate what you're looking at. That simple metal container, with its distinctive shape and clever closure, represents engineering excellence that outlasted the regime that created it. The design was so perfect that we still haven't improved on it. And remember that America almost threw it away. Remember that institutional arrogance nearly cost the Allies one of their most important logistical advantages. Remember that sometimes the best solution already exists, and the hardest part is recognizing it. Sometimes the most important innovations don't announce themselves. Sometimes they just hold gasoline. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more of these overlooked stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected.